I do want to know from you, are there certain expectations that you have of mentees coming into your lab? Are there certain things that you think they should expect of you or any other mentor if they're going to really make the most of their time?
And so absolutely, I think, so to start with the first part of your question, I expect that people are going to be engaged and try their best and, you know, put their effort into learning about what we're doing. So we have, when you start in the lab too, it, of course, you're interested in autism, to take my lab as an example. You're not going to start working with kids with autism on day one. That just doesn't happen because this is a specialized type of work. And so undergraduate students in the lab start with helping with data processing, and we have a whole training procedure where you're watching videos and learning about autism. We have a journal club for the undergrads in the lab where you're reading the literature. This is where doctoral students start in the lab. Really, you have to have a lot of experience, both empirically based, theoretically based, and clinically based before you're actually working with families. So it's more seldom that an undergraduate will actually be participating in testing, although that does happen. To get there, my expectations, and I would love to see every student in the lab who's interested in the work we're doing continue on and do an honors thesis and participate in papers and present posters. And to do that, my expectations are that you're really invested, that you follow through with commitments, that you show up when you say you're going to show up, that you do the readings, that you ask good questions, that you let us know when you're interested in different aspects of the project, so that we know what kind of opportunities to offer you. So just because you start working on processing language data doesn't mean that is what you're going to be doing if you're in the lab for 2 years. It's where you're starting, and there are opportunities. We've had students who've been in the lab for 3 years and maybe stayed on as staff members. And I won't go on any more tangents, but yes, these are just exciting and really
That's
rewarding.
absolutely a trajectory, right?
Yes, absolutely. No, and they're some of my best stories are of people who were in courses that I taught, who joined the lab as an independent study student and just blew me out of the water with their performance, and how invested they were, how willing they were to just learn everything and contribute to our projects in ways large and small. And that led to amazing opportunities for those students, where many of them went on to doctoral or medical school, and sometimes going straight out of undergraduate. Oftentimes, I think, which is more often the case these days, spending some additional time in the lab after, so post-baccalaureate experience, actually working full time in the lab, which is important to think about. And this is a conversation that students should have when once you're in a lab and people too. What are the trajectories for people in the lab? And given the field that you're interested, or the pathway that you're interested in, how long does it take to actually be competitive? For a clinical PhD, you're going to need some time outside of your bachelor's to get some research and clinical experience, often 2 years, sometimes more. And boy, if you can do that in one lab where you're happy and you found an interesting research project to engage in, it can just, that's the path to take that leads to paper authorship. And not you, it's very rare in this kind of work to earn authorship on a paper, just as maybe a 2-quarter undergraduate experience. There are other labs where they're doing more basic science, maybe, or working with undergraduates where there's just sort of an endless flow of participants possible, and more basic, I think, kind of research paradigms where that might be more feasible.
I think that's a really good point. I sometimes frame this as, you're paying your dues in terms of giving that work to the lab that's giving you this mentorship and experience. But one thing that I think is really true is that you can't write a good paper or really understand the work without having that exposure to the data and getting to know the population in that intimate way.
Exactly.
So it's partly about the fact that, papership is a tightly held privilege and something you really have to work for. And also that conceptually, you wouldn't be qualified to hold authorship or to really contribute until you have that depth and breadth of knowledge.
It's really true. And I'll say too, something when I'm reviewing applications for our PhD programs, there are personal statements where I can tell, okay, this person, so their CV is impressive and this person really understood the projects they were involved in. And there are other CVs and personal statements where, okay, well, they were involved in lots of projects and in great labs, but it's more like okay, then I learned how to administer this and I was in that lab and this lab without any sort of deep understanding of what they were doing in those labs. And so, make
More
sure,
like a checkbox, in other words.
exactly, yeah. And I think every lab is wanting to have students who really are interested in understanding the projects deeply.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point and something I keep coming back to when I'm figuring out, what advice would be helpful to sort of all undergrads who have questions about research. And part of it is about figuring out what you're excited for, what you're excited to do. Because the readiness to send that email and to ask those questions about, Dr. Losh's research and other opportunities in the lab, that often comes from caring very deeply, saying, I have my own questions about this population or this kind of research. And that can really build on itself without feeling like, oh, I have to say yes to things, or I really need to take initiative, and coming at it from that angle, like we were saying, the checkbox method.
Yeah.
So
there's one other part that I wanted to ask Dr. Losh for a second. When we're talking about communication with students and how hard Northwestern undergrads work and how overextended they may be, I've run across this with undergrads where they have had several exams or several papers all due at once, and they're afraid to go to their PI or to their graduate student lab and say, I need to step back for a couple of days, or I've got so much, and they're afraid to admit that they're drowning a little bit. So can you speak a little bit about what you would suggest they do in that situation?
Oh, I'm so glad you asked that question. Say something. We want to know. We want to know. And I mean, I can't think of one instance where we haven't been able to accommodate a break for students who are feeling like they're drowning or there's exams coming up. And, say something, and say something early on so that any critical work can be, we can plan to redistribute who might chip in on that. But absolutely, no, I mean, this is, working in a lab is not like punching a time clock sort of job where, you're there and that's all that matters. We want to support you as students and your development, and we want you to have a wonderful experience in our labs and throughout your undergraduate education. And we've all been there. So no, just say something, tell us early on.
Yeah, I think being really proactive about asking for help, being able to look at your schedule, look at your syllabi for the quarter and say, oh, week 10 is going to be rough.
Yeah.
And saying something ahead of time is always great. But I also know that people do find themselves, for whatever reason, maybe you didn't mean to procrastinate, or maybe you had a personal emergency and you really do feel like you're drowning. It's also okay.
Yeah.
We're talking about being proactive and saying something early, speaking up often. That's all great advice, but also being able to acknowledge, hey, I'm overwhelmed and I need help right now. Much, much better than disappearing or letting the ball drop or suffering. We don't want you to be struggling like that.
And oftentimes you can't anticipate. Exactly. You're absolutely right. Sometimes you can't anticipate that you're going to be in a situation where you're overwhelmed and dealing with too much, and whether it be academics or personal,
or pandemic.
Yes.
Or the pandemic.
Right.
We've all had a year-long crash course
Yes.
in
No
being
kidding.
overwhelmed in an unanticipated way.
No kidding. No kidding. No, I mean, really, I think that I think most students would be pleasantly surprised to know just how empathetic a PI is towards. I mean, we understand. We just need to know, because if you don't say anything, I'm not sure. Are you not in my lab because you don't care and you're wanting to move to another lab? Are you not showing up because of something serious? Just, and not that you need to share personal information, but just speak up and say, just let us know, so that
Yeah.
we know how to support you. And yeah, absolutely, that's
I think that's a really good point, right? No one is obligated to share really personal details, or maybe won't feel comfortable doing that because it is a professional relationship as much as there's this mentor dynamic happening. But you can say, I'm having a personal emergency, or
exactly.
some
And
unexpected things have happened, and here's how long I think I'm going to need to be out of the lab.
And also know, absolutely, and also know that, and so professors should have we've all had some training and what resources are available at Northwestern and beyond, and we can often help to connect you with those resources. So that's another reason to say something, just let us know what's going on, and details aside, just that, if you're struggling, say something so that we can support you.
Well, and that's the communication piece of it as well. I
Mhm.
think that there are a lot of different ways I've seen undergraduates and mentees respond to feeling overwhelmed. And
Mhm.
sometimes it is that they don't show up, or that they completely stop responding to communication. Other times they force themselves to power through the work,
Yeah.
and the fact that they're suffering is showing in that work.
Mhm.
So that's another disclaimer I think is important to issue. Even if you're still responding to email, you're still doing all of your coding or what other data handling you're doing.
Mhm.
If you're not sleeping, or you're feeling really extremely anxious, that can show up in mistakes that we make, right? We're human, we're not computers. And I think it's important to remember that even if you're like, oh no, I can show up to the lab meeting with Dr. Losh, I'll just sit with a really blank stare, but I'll be there, right? I haven't slept in 2 days, but it's okay. You know, most of us would much rather, not to speak for Dr. Losh here, but much rather that you take that time to sleep and that you tell us that you need to take that break.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And communication is the key. And there, you can always communicate with the PI in the lab, but hopefully, I think most labs have a structure too, where you develop more direct connections and training relationships and collaborations with the grad students in the lab and other undergrads. And labs are like little families. So feel free to reach out to people and we definitely do that in a proactive way, for sure.
That's all very encouraging, and much of it I wish I'd known when I was starting out as an undergraduate in research.
Me too. I remember being so nervous, and a lot of the questions you're asking. I mean, the PI that I first started working with as a sophomore in college, I referred to her as doctor for probably 2 years longer than I needed to, just because I was so nervous and didn't ask questions. But but you all can avoid this sort of anxiety if you just,
The
yeah,
purpose of the series is to
exactly.
allay some anxiety around starting research. I know you've touched on this a little bit about taking initiative and finding research you're really interested in and then expressing that interest, right?
Mhm.
That deep and genuine excitement. But thinking about students who stand out as being really engaged or have been some of your best mentees in the past, beyond taking the initiative, is there anything else about those students that really helped them stand out? And it's okay if not. I just want to give you another open-ended question opportunity.
No, it's a great question. I will say strong writing skills. That's something that goes beyond initiative. Well, it's maybe related to initiative, working to develop your writing skills. I think students with strong writing skills have done very well in the lab. I mean, it just makes it easier for you to contribute in a, in a productive way, and much more likely that you're able to take the lead on substantive products from the lab. So take advantage of courses that have writing assignments and take that feedback that you get from the papers and meet with your professors. I think Northwestern has wonderful resources for writing development. Take advantage of those. So that's a really big one. I think just a willingness to dive in at all levels. So if you see someone who needs help, offering to help, even if it's stuffing participant envelopes because we've got to get out a bunch of recruitment materials, and that doesn't seem like fun, but it has to get done. I still do this. We it all has to get done. And when someone offers to help and is happy to help, it makes a big difference for the productivity of the lab and our team as a whole. And that sort of camaraderie, I think, is built by just a generosity and willingness to engage and contribute.
And I love that example that you used of stuffing the envelopes, because I do think
not glamorous, but
it's just true that there's no job too small to matter in this field. Because whenever we're doing something as part of our study, especially working with people, we are doing things to make the participants feel more appreciated or make their lives easier so that they can remember their appointment with us and come in. All of those little steps that we take that can feel kind of like grunt work, or like, oh, well, I wanted to solve this really complicated question. All of these little things that we do are in service of that larger goal.
Right.
And I think it's important to remember that when you're figuring out what your expectations are as an undergraduate or as a mentee, which is that, I love you said generosity. I feel like that's exactly it. Like there's no job that's too small to be important, especially when the work we're doing is important.
Absolutely.
So I feel like we've really touched on a lot of the questions that we'd sort of thought of in advance, but are there other things that you really wish, someone had told you as an undergraduate or as a junior researcher?
Good question. I mean, I really had amazing research experiences as an undergraduate, and a lot of it came through. So it came both from the PI, the professor who led the lab, but also the graduate students and other undergraduates in the lab. I just learned a ton. And I mean, so I feel like I got excellent guidance. I think
Well, it sounds like you treated it as a learning experience, which is really helpful. Right?
It absolutely, yeah. And I think
I'm curious, Dr. Losh, how did you get involved in that lab? That was such a great experience. Did you just reach out in an email to the PI, the faculty member?
I took the path that I advised. I did well in a class that I really loved, and they had a research opportunity that they announced, and I applied for it. I remember being called, so it was a rigorous interview process, and I still remember getting the phone call that I was accepted into the lab and screaming. I was so excited. It was amazing. No, so and students should know too, when you do really well in a class, you stand out. I mean, we notice as instructors, as professors, who's engaged, who's writing excellent papers, who's really learning the material, who's asking the questions that are, really probing the material. So that was important. And I know for a fact in my letter of recommendation for doctoral programs that this professor wrote about my performance in that class too. So, which I do also. It's you're able to say this person performed within the top X% of the class and wrote an excellent paper commensurate with graduate student writing, and so those are things that don't go unnoticed. So
yeah,
that level is important.
I think it's very easy to hear this and take the message home that, oh, I'm always being evaluated in everything. And
Oh,
that can be kind of anxiety provoking,
sure.
but instead it's more like what you do and how you say it matters. So when you're participating in class, that is important. When you're writing, I was talking with two of your lovely graduate students about how they got research experiences. And when you're writing maybe that first cold email to someone you've never met before, which is pretty common nowadays, to have to reach out to a total stranger without that comfort of having been in their class or having gotten to know them at some level, making sure that you are coming across professionally and coming across well, because, you know, a too casual email may not represent you, but
Yeah.
that's all people are going to have to go off of.
Mhm.
So I think those are important things to keep in mind. It's that, you know, how you communicate matters, and communicating, reaching out does make you stand out.
It does make you stand out. And I guess this is, I would give one other piece of advice when you're interested in a lab. Um, Emails get lost, right? So sometimes people, I during a busy quarter probably get, well, hundreds of emails in a day. And so don't take it personally if someone doesn't respond. And I think the best strategy as a student is to go to that person's lab website and see, do they have another contact? Right, so who are the grad students in that lab? And so like on our website, there's a whole page for people who might be interested in our lab, and it says, contact this person. And that person will, you know, they're not gonna lose an email, and it's not, but no, it's not intentional, don't give up. But you know, if the PI doesn't respond immediately, send them another message, and don't take it personally, the emails get lost. And see, you know, check their website and see if there's a grad student or a lab coordinator or lab manager that you can contact also.
I think that's some really helpful practical advice, which is, again, something I know I wish I had when I was starting out. A lesson you learn the hard way, right?
Yeah, no, and I could understand it not getting not if I hadn't gotten a response, I would have been devastated and probably not followed up. But you know, having
But following up is good and appropriate and professional.
it's absolutely professional.
Yep.
And yes, and you know, some of that's another characteristic of some of the best students and staff members in my lab is that follow up, really showing that they're interested and understanding that, oh, this email might have gotten lost and, you know, over the holidays or something, and following up is it's always appreciated.
Yeah, I think of it as doing a favor for someone, because then you're not requiring them to remember that or find it months later and feel a little guilty. Because I feel guilty if I miss an email from someone.
Of course, no, nobody wants to do that.
All right. Well, thank you so much for your time and for being so generous with your advice and experience. I think that this is something people can really benefit from getting to see and listen to. I will say, Jessica and I didn't think we would need to use the full time.
And we did.
Yeah, but talking to you is just, it's so easy to do
Molly,
that.
thank you.
Well, you got so many great questions and just thoughtful takeaways from this discussion. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you for saying that. All of it comes from the notes that your lab provided us when we initially asked about,
Right.
you know, what do undergrads need to know? What takeaways should they have? So I'm really excited about this.
This is great.
I am too, and I will say, so I have had such wonderful experiences working with undergraduates in the lab. You know, we've had experiences with you know, more than I would say, well, more than a handful of undergrads who have ended up contributing at a level that is commensurate with doctoral student work. You know, really pioneering new ideas, heading papers, and that's just a really amazing, there's such talent among our undergraduates, and it's a real pleasure to get to work with them in the lab, to have them in the lab, to have their ideas contributing to our projects. And so we've really loved it.
And I would say it's also because of strong mentoring, like from you and your graduate students.
Yeah.
It makes a huge difference.
I think it's a dynamic, right? If you foster
absolutely
a community or an environment where undergrads feel like they can share ideas,
yep,
then they're going to share ideas.
Yeah.
Otherwise, they might sit there and keep those ideas in their head, worried they're not good enough. So,
yeah.
There's
Well,
something to be
thanks
said for that.
again. This is great, Molly.